We're pleased our next speaker will be Dr. Davis Bitton. Davis is a retired University of Utah history professor. After serving a mission in France, he graduated from BYU and then received his MA and PhD degrees from Princeton University. He has taught at the University of Texas and the University of California at Santa Barbara and served for 10 years as assistant church historian. Dr. Bitton is co-author with Leonard J. Arrington of The Mormon Experience, A History of the Latter-day Saints, and Saints Without Halos, The Human Side of Mormon History. He compiled a guide to Mormon diaries and autobiographies, and his most recent books are Images of the Prophet Joseph Smith and George Q. Cannon, a biography. Many of Davis's books are available in our bookstore in the back, and I'm sure that he'll be interested in talking with each of you as we have the Meet the Author sessions later today. He asked me to cut the biography just a little bit short, but I invite you to read it. It's in your program. At this time, we'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Davis Bitton.
You have two previous papers on homosexuality and feminism. It's hard to revert back to the distant historical past, but I've been told that some of the issues that trouble some of our members and others are historical issues, and so I've decided to talk a little bit about my perspective under the title, I Don't Have a Testimony of the History of the Church. I don't have a testimony of the history of the church. That's why I can be a historian and also a believing Latter-day Saint. I will expand on this idea, but first let me address some related questions. Do all well-informed historians become anti-Mormons? The critic would have you believe that they are disinterested pursuers of truth. There they were, minding their own business, going about their conscientious study of church history. And shock and dismay, they came across this, whatever this is, that blew them away. As hurtful as it is for them, they can no longer believe in the church. And out of love for you, they now want to help you see the light of the day. Well, let's get one thing clear. There's nothing in church history, zilch, nada, that leads inevitably to the conclusion that the church is false. There is nothing that requires the conclusion that Joseph Smith was a fraud. How can I say this with such confidence? For the simple reason that the historians who know most about our church history have been and are faithful, committed members of the church. Or to restate the situation more precisely, there are faithful Latter-day Saint historians who know as much about the subject as any anti-Mormon, or as anyone who writes on the subject from an outside perspective. With few exceptions, they know much, much more. They have not been blown away. They have not gnashed their teeth and abandoned their faith. To repeat, they have found nothing that forces the extreme conclusion that our enemies like to promote. We need to reject the simple-minded, inaccurate picture that divides people into two classes. On the one hand, according to our enemies, are the sincere seekers of truth. On the other, the sincere seekers of truth, full of goodness and charity. On the other hand, in their view, stand the ignorant Mormons. Even faithful Mormon scholars, according to them, must be ignorant. Otherwise, they are dishonest, playing their part in a conspiracy to deceive people. Can we see how ridiculous this picture is? It is a travesty on both sides. Many Latter-day Saints may not know their history in depth, but some of them know a good deal. As for Latter-day Saint scholars, as a group, they compare favorably with any similar group of historians. It will not do to charge them with being dishonest. I happen to know most of them and have no hesitation in rejecting this smear of their character. On the other hand, your typical anti-Mormon is no disinterested pursuer of the truth. If you are confronted with a problem or some kind of non-faith promoting take on church history, the chances are that your willing helper can lay no claim to doing any significant research in Mormon history. Oblivious to the primary sources, unread in the journal literature, the critic has picked up his nugget from previous anti-Mormon writers and offers it to you as though it is a fresh discovery. Most of the time, it is anything but new. It is a stock item in a litany of anti-Mormon claims that serve their purpose. It is a broken record. Well, why does it accomplish anything? Because they don't tell you how stale it is, and of course will not let you know where answers have already been provided. To you, it is new, or may be new, and following into the trap, you think you have been deceived by the church. And here is something that is seriously damaging to the restored gospel. Like peddlers of snake oil from time immemorial, the critic is willing to take full advantage of this situation. A recent man with a broken lance provides us with a good example of the impression they wish to convey. In his preface, Grant Palmer lists the faculty of the Brigham Young University, the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for Church History, scholars from other disciplines, seminary and institute faculty, and the Mormon History Association as those who have published, critiqued, and reevaluated a veritable mountain of evidence. The impression he wishes to leave is that all these people reject traditional church history, favoring his own interpretation. Question time. How many historians who are deeply familiar with the sources on Mormon origins still find it possible to remain in the fold and are not swept away by the breezy arguments that this book presents? Palmer doesn't tell us. There are quite a few things he doesn't tell us. We might start with a few names like Richard Bushman, James B. Allen, Glenn Leonard, Richard Anderson, Larry Porter, Milton Bachman, Dean Jesse, and Ronald Walker, all of whom are thoroughly familiar with the issues and sources. Joining their ranks are younger historians like Stephen Harper and Mark Ashurst McGee, and I have left out many other names. I am not claiming that all historians are believing Mormons. That would be patently absurd. The person who approaches Mormons in their history for the first time and tries to evaluate the historiography discovers that from the beginning, disbelieving historians have written about these events. They will also come across historians like Hubert Howe Bancroft, who simply put the truth question on the shelf. No one denies that such approaches are possible. But our novice will also quickly discover important work by Latter-day Saint scholars. In other words, those who know most about Mormon history do not simply and inevitably join the ranks of the disbelievers. It is quite possible, apparently, to know a great deal about Mormon history and still be a practicing, believing Latter-day Saint. Why do I spend time insisting on this simple, obvious fact? Because our opponents want to leave the opposite impression, and because for many Latter-day Saints it is sufficient to know that faithful historians who are thoroughly familiar with the issues do not accept the interpretations and conclusions of the would-be destroyers of faith. I have not discussed any specific historical issues. My point is simpler than that. It is simply this: historians who have devoted many years of study to this material and to these issues have not felt compelled to abandon their faith in the restored gospel. Expectation. May I reminisce just a little? The year was 1979. Leonard Arrington and I had just published a one-volume history of the church entitled The Mormon Experience, a history of the Latter-day Saints. Non-alcoholic. The story behind the story is that this work was intended primarily for the non-Mormon audience. To reach that audience, we had to have a national publisher. Alfred Knopf or any other publisher of the same stature would not, we realized, allow us to publish a propaganda tract for the church. To communicate with a general reading audience, we had to use terminology that would be understood, meaning that we had to avoid in-house terms and expressions that may be appropriate for our manuals and other books written for church members. To pass muster with our publisher, we could not write history that would be too triumphalist or celebratory. We knew we were walking a narrow line. Some church members may not have liked our book. On the other hand, we were quite surprised, but of course pleased, to find out that our book even led to some conversions, or more exactly, provoked the interest and openness that allowed a conversion to occur. I will never forget how jubilant we felt one day when we received the report from our publisher that the Mormon Experience had been ordered by 600 libraries. During that euphoric time, Leonard and I attended autograph parties, and we were interviewed, and we gave quite a few talks. In one interview, we were asked to describe the relationship between faith and history. Here is Leonard Arrington's answer. I have never felt any conflict between maintaining my faith and writing historical truth. If one sticks to historical truth, that shouldn't damage his faith in any way. The Lord doesn't require us to believe anything that's untrue. My long interest in Mormon history, and I've been working on it for 33 years, has only served to build my testimony of the gospel, and I find the same thing happening to other Latter-day Saint historians as well. My own answer went like this. What's potentially damaging or challenging to faith depends entirely, I think, on one's expectations and not necessarily history. Any kind of experience can be shattering to faith if the expectation is such that one is not prepared for the experience. A person can be converted to the church in a distant part of the globe and have great pictures of Salt Lake City with the temple looming large in the center of the city. Here we have our home teaching in nice little blocks, and we all go to church on Sunday, they believe. It won't take very many hours or days before the reality of experiencing Salt Lake City can be devastating to a person with those expectations. The problem is not the religion, the problem is the incongruity between the expectation and the reality. History is similar. I'm still quoting myself. One moves into the land of history, so to speak, and finds shattering incongruities which can be devastating to faith. But the problem is with the expectation, not with the history. One of the jobs of the historians and educators in the church who teach people growing up in the church and people coming into the church is to try to see to it that the expectations are realistic. The Lord does not expect us to believe lies. We believe in being honest and true, as well as chaste and benevolent. My experience, like Leonard's, has not been one of having my faith destroyed. I think my faith has changed and deepened and become richer and more consistent with the complexities of human experience. Expectation. We must have realistic expectations. That is true at many points in life, in choosing a profession, in entering a marriage, in joining an athletic team, in moving to a new location. Think not when ye gather to Zion. That song is no longer in our hymnal, but it served a purpose for many, many years, that everything would be perfect. It was the idea of the hymn. And that was good advice for the immigrants leaving Europe to join the saints in the West. And it is good counsel for students of our LDS history. Think not when ye study church history, we might sing, that everyone was always smiling, that the women were always dressed in freshly laundered, starched pinafores, that the men spoke softly, grammatically, and always politely, or that the children were well-mannered angels. Think not. In other words, get real. I suppose this is a message to those church members who have such tender eyes and ears that the real history of real people comes as shock and awe. "Oh no," they whine, "this can't be true." Or attacking a historian, quick to judge, they accuse him or her of lacking spirituality or coveting the praise of the world. My message in many such cases is, please don't speak until you know what you are talking about. Or if that sentence is too long, try this: grow up. Now, don't stop the presses and say that this is my only message today. I also have some free advice for those writing critical history. To enlarge our scope and recognize the universality of the challenge, let me say a few words about an American history book that you may have heard about. It has sold over 1 million copies. It's entitled A People's History of the United States. The author is Howard Zinn, Z-I-N-N. If you wonder why young people have no historical heroes, read Zinn. If we wonder why those on the left hate America so much, read Zinn. His People's History is a long indictment of America, government, politics, and leaders. Here is a short critique of Zinn written by a fellow Marxist who at least was honest enough to recognize bad history. Like most propagandists, Michael Kazin writes, Zinn measures individuals according to his own rigid standard of how they should have thought and acted. Thus he depicts John Brown as an unblemished martyr, but sees Lincoln as nothing more than a cautious politician. To make sense of a nation's entire history, this review continues, an author has to explain the weight and meaning of worldviews that are not his own, and that as an engaged citizen he does not favor. Zinn has no taste for this disagreeable task. Zinn is an evangelist of little imagination, for whom history is one long chain of stark moral dualities. That's a description of Howard Zinn, who's not writing about Mormon history, but I can assure you that it is a pretty good description of some of the histories written by those who can find not one good thing to report in all of Mormon history. Let me tell you about a thought experiment. It goes approximately like this. I've just tried this out. I approach an episode of church history or skim it over so I know the approximate contours. I then ask myself 3 questions. First, what is the minimum I must find here if it is to be consistent with the truth of the Restoration? Very often the answer is blank, because that large issue is simply unaffected. Second, what from the point of view of a believing Latter-day Saint is the worst thing I could find? Here I let my mind run free. I pull all the stops. For example, in my imagination, Joseph Smith plans out ahead of time just what he wanted his family to think. So he goes into the woods. He waits a certain interval of time, then pretending and acting, he rushes home and acts like he had seen a vision. This is my imagination. I hope I've made that clear. This is a thought experiment. Or, as a second example, there were meetings in the Kirtland Temple just prior to its dedication. And this little exercise takes 30 seconds or so. Someone came in with a plentiful supply of hard liquor. Everyone there had a drink, and then another, and then another. Soon they were feeling no pain. Some started singing in nonsense syllables. Others, unable to walk a straight line, said things like, "I can top that, I can see angels swooping around the room," and so on. You get the idea. In other words, I am seeing this whole scene as a ridiculous drunken spree. This is a version of the worst case scenario approach. And it's just a little fun to try this on a few incidents, and then you lose interest in doing it. But I am now prepared for my third question. What do I actually find when I consider the evidence? I can say that never, and I mean never, do the events match the worst case scenario or even come close. My imagination had prepared me to face the music, if you will, and to reveal behavior that was not all perfectly pious, if that's what I find. But every time I go through this exercise, I end up with the same conclusion. Yes, there were different personalities, mistakes may have been made, and so on. But there is nothing here, nothing so disabling that I must collapse in a swoon with the certain knowledge that Mormonism is rotten, bad, false, lacking in authenticity. It's just not there. Of what do you have a testimony? A number of years ago, I was asked to speak at a combined priesthood meeting in the Federal Heights area. At the conclusion of my remarks, someone asked this question: what effect has your extensive study of church history had on your testimony? I wasn't really prepared for the question. I gave several examples of faith-promoting incidents, but that was the second and the least important part of my answer. The first words out of my mouth, and I assure you they were almost reflex, without long preliminary thought, were, I never had a testimony of church history. My testimony is in the gospel of Jesus Christ. I've had people who've heard me talk or been in some of my classes at the university, and they won't remember one other thing, but they somehow remember that one line. Let me anticipate a question that is bound to occur to some. Are there not some historical events that are essential to the restoration? Can I be indifferent to the following claims? Joseph Smith had a vision in the sacred grove. Plates were found, kept in his possession for a period of time, shown to witnesses and translated. Heavenly beings restored keys and priesthood authority. The list could be lengthened, but let us stop with those. These are historical events, if you will, events that occurred in historical time, but not a single one of them is subject to proof or disproof by historians. If I have a testimony of these events, it is not because of my advanced historical training or many years of delving into the primary documents of church history. My friend and colleague at the University of Utah, who taught Utah history for many years, was David E. Miller. He taught a course in Utah history that was popular among all kinds of students. After summarizing the first vision, he said, now you can't prove things like this by historical evidence. You can't disprove them either. Bearing no testimony, but also using no ridicule, Professor Miller noted what Joseph Smith said, and then moved on to follow the history of the people who accepted the prophet's leadership. Well, short of being present during these transcendent manifestations, and let us say recording them with a camcorder, all we can do is quote what people said about them. If any of us have a testimony of their historicity, it is not because of the kind of evidence that would stand up in a courtroom. It is because we believe other witnesses. It is because we have our own spiritual confirmation. I am not required to let historians determine for me what I will believe. When I say I don't have a testimony of church history, I mean that the gospel of Jesus Christ is not subject to the scrutiny by the feeble tools of the historian. The creation, the fall, the redemption, the merciful plan of the great Creator, all of these elements are simply not subject to proof or disproof by looking over old documents. On the other hand, the people who believed and accepted those doctrines are proper subjects for historical inquiry. In their achievements and failures, their high points and low, their trials and triumphs, in all the crooked timber of their humanity, these are imperfect people on the Lord's errand. They stumble and fall. They pick themselves up. They complain and lose their tempers. They become discouraged. They sometimes abandon ship. No one ever said the history of the church was the history of perfect people. In fact, if I understand correctly, the church is for the perfecting of the saints. Well, now, what was this religion they had subscribed to? If the Latter-day Saints in 1840 or 1870 or 1950 or 2004 were asked to lie, cheat, and steal, to be thoroughly bad people, let's hear about it. Let's see the evidence. Such a case cannot be made by any fair-minded investigator, but I don't doubt for a minute that those capable of making disgraceful documentaries like the Godmakers would like people to believe the worst of the Mormons. The makers, promoters, and distributors of such scandalous misrepresentations are possessed of a spirit, but it is not the spirit of kindness, not the spirit of charity, and not the spirit of truth. Consider the inexhaustible resource of material unscrupulous anti-Mormons can draw upon from 17 decades of church history. With people joining the church from different backgrounds, with human differences that inevitably manifest themselves, there will be examples of just about everything. You want a Mormon who was a thief, an embezzler, a grave robber, a cannibal? You want a Mormon who was not always in perfect control of his life and who made mistakes? That's too easy. As J. Golden Kimball might have said, hell, we can come up with cross-dressers, plagiarists, forgers. If you need someone who could recite the Articles of Faith and the Protocols of Zion while hanging from his knees on a flying trapeze, we can probably oblige you. Keeps life interesting, doesn't it? Dipping into this huge reservoir of human beings, plucking examples that suit their purpose, anti-Mormons will delight audiences already disposed to viewing Mormons as strange, unenlightened people. Their job is to make Mormons and their religion appear ridiculous and evil. As someone said about the disgraceful Michael Moore documentary, Fahrenheit 9/11, I see Michael Moore here in the audience. Here's the review. Any skilled filmmaker could fashion a movie making any American look like a pinhead. That's easy to do. Just get a bunch of video, some people who hate the guy, some factoids that may or may not be true, heat it up with sardonic rhetoric, and serve. Presto, Fahrenheit 9/11. And you can do history in that same way. And some of our friendly enemies do it that way. Another thing, your dedicated anti-Mormon has a repertoire of horror stories. If we think of our critic as an escapee from the reportorial staff of National Enquirer, we may be on the right track. Notice the similarities. First, we cannot be at all sure that the allegation is true. Think flying saucers landing on the church office building, but seen only by one highly favored witness. Even if the negative incident, whatever it is, can be substantiated, our critic studiously avoids addressing the question of how representative it is. The Lafferty brothers on death row in the Utah State Penitentiary, there, according to some, are some typical Mormons. The critic may make the argument less ridiculous by saying, yes, they are extreme, but they show what Mormonism can lead to. We see how dangerous it is. We have current examples. The Lost Boys, these teenage males expelled from the Warren Jeffs community. I think Andrea Radke mentioned them. Well, these are not Mormons, you say, and Jeffs is no Latter-day Saint. Oh, yes, but they show the cruelty, the superstition, and the authoritarianism within the Latter-day Saint movement. I shudder to think what the Mark Hacking story might do to the reputation of the church. If he's not typical, you see what belief in Mormonism can lead to. Now, I do not have a testimony of the history of the church. In making this declaration, I have no need to deny that our church history is peopled with many inspiring individuals. What they preached and what they studied and what they taught can be studied. While enhancing my historical understanding, I often find reinforcement for my faith. But I uncouple the two, testimony and history. Thankfully, testimony is not dependent on scholars. I leave ample room for human perversity. I am not wed to any single, simple version of the past. I leave room for new information and new interpretations. My testimony in the eternal gospel does not hang in the balance. One thing such a distinction does for me is to disencumber me from a crippling sense of the kind of history I must write. I can tell it as it is. More precisely, since none of us believe in completely objective reporting, I can give my best effort at presenting what I find. I don't have to be running scared all the time, fearful that I may something or quote something that will shake up poor little Sister Blavatsky or new convert Brother Campanella. I won't take delight in affronting them, but I should be able to study my subject and give my best effort to understanding the personalities and the events. So I studied the colonization of the Little Colorado in 1876. What a terrible assignment that was. Leader of the colonists was Lot Smith, a veteran of the Utah War. Tough and strong in his leadership, Lot Smith did not please everyone. He was no namby-pamby. But my history reports what I discovered, trying to be fair to all. For you see, I don't have a history. I don't have a testimony of the history of the church. I studied marriage among the Mormons in the second half of the 19th century. Was there more polygamy than I had been led to believe? We heard some percentages a while ago. So be it. I report what the best evidence supports. Were there more than a few examples of unhappy plural wives and more divorces than we had realized? So be it. I report what I find. I don't lean all the way in the other direction, mind you, but I report what I find. For I don't have a testimony of the history of the church. Did many of Joseph Smith's, we're moving backward in time, did many of Joseph Smith's neighbors sign affidavits describing him in unfavorable terms? Well, so be it. I report that fact. In order properly to evaluate these, I consider the agenda of the man who gathered them, compiled them, and often wrote them for the signature of people. I certainly weigh into the balance the testimony of others who describe Joseph in very different terms, but we're trying to get at the truth here, or as close to it as we can. I don't have a testimony of the history of the church. What kind of history do we need? I think we're on the home stretch here. What kind of history do we need? For practically all the questions that seem to trouble people or that are used in an effort to dislodge members from their faith, satisfactory answers are available. Answers are there for the sincere truth seeker. Without naming names for fear of leaving someone out, I think it is obvious that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a number of ready and highly skilled defenders, some of them in this room. I commend the members of this organization as well as others who have entered the fray. In many instances, the answers they provide are decisive, leaving the critic with no leg to stand on. There is always work to do, new questions, and some that require answers more profound than the initial defenders have come up with. But obviously, we are not tongue-tied and helpless. The hope of the detractors, of course, is that they will reach with their jaundiced version people who are unaware of what the defenders have already made available. And sadly, when much of our population is made up of non-readers, a well-placed fiery dart of the adversary might be fatal. When I was in graduate school, one of our seminars included a unit on the Counter-Reformation. or the Catholic Reformation, as it's sometimes called, of the 16th century. For over 30 years of university teaching, I have introduced undergraduate and graduate students to this subject. My own understanding of the Catholic Reformation of the 16th century moved up by a series of steps. First, I knew some treatments of the subject in Latter-day Saint lesson manuals. That was when I was pre-university. Then as an undergraduate, I deepened my factual knowledge by reading a reasonably good chapter in a standard textbook. The Counter-Reformation was pretty much depicted as a belated response to the Protestant challenge. Some of the manifestations, the rise of the Jesuit order, the Council of Trent, even the lamentable massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve in France, could easily be interpreted as further evidence of the corruption of Roman Catholicism. The popes are often presented as the bad guys of Christian history. As a teenager, I had been introduced to this negative view of the popes. I knew a few names like Innocent III and the infamous Alexander VI, but I understood very little. On the graduate level, you simply don't get away with the textbook level of understanding. I took it upon myself to read Leopold von Ranke's 3-volume history of the popes. On one level, it was an instructive example of the use of newly available primary sources, such as the Relazioni of the Venetian ambassadors. As I read through this work, I thought, maybe things are not quite as simple as I thought. Above all, I remember reading Ludwig von Pastor's History of the Popes, multi-volume work in about 20 volumes. Product of a lifetime of research and writing in German and then translated into English. Pastor's History of the Popes was a real eye-opener. I will not make the mistake of describing this work as objective. What Pastor does is to use the internal church documents to describe in detail the successive challenges confronted by the popes, the reports and documents they had to go on, the urging of different advisors, sometimes the false starts and the backtracking of papal policy. Studied in this way, the popes simply cannot be credibly portrayed in the cartoon-like terms of their adversaries. Some popes were good, some were bad, most were somewhere in between. Most were doing the best they could under the circumstances. The closer one gets to their minds through a careful scrutiny of the documents that were available to them and the letters and speeches that came from them, the less one is inclined to defame them in simple terms. I don't recommend Pastor as the last word on the subject, but his great history is still instructive, and it must be known by anyone presuming to treat the subject of the Catholic popes. Some of you have already anticipated my conclusion. This is the kind of history, or at least one kind of history, not the only kind, but one kind of history we need in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Speaking from a background of reading many diaries and minutes of meetings, as well as letters and reports on which decisions were based, I can confidently say that such history, in addition to being closer to the reality of the actual experience, enhances appreciation for the dedicated, sincere men and women who made decisions and moved the work along. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to consider them inspired or vested with God's authority. If you're a non-member, that is a separate question. But in the face of such history, you simply cannot portray them as evil or as simpletons. Since all history is affected to one degree or another by the faith position of the historian, I rejoice when any topic is treated by someone who is both a believer and a good historian. Ideally, the result will be so conscientious, willing to face the facts and consider the complexity of the events, that the resulting article or book will command attention. Not wishing to be misunderstood, let me say I also welcome non-Mormon historians and will praise their works when they deserve it. Consider a current example. The Mountain Meadows Massacre of 1857 has been a cause célèbre ever since. Anti-Mormons have loved that event. They describe it in excruciating detail, conveying the impression that this was Mormonism, pure and simple. Instead of the smiling, clean-cut young people with name tags, the real Mormonism lurking behind the facade is the massacre and other events like it. This is what they would like us to believe. Typically, the anti-Mormon writer is not satisfied with describing the event. The dramatic group killing is used as a foundation for larger conclusions: the perfidy of Brigham Young, the intrinsic cruelty of the Mormon religion, the horror of its doctrines that would allow such a thing, or as with John Krakauer's recent book, the narrowness, self-righteousness, and violence of all religion, using the Mountain Meadows as a case study. Well, how should faithful Latter-day Saints respond? I quite like George Q. Cannon's answer to R.N. Baskin. R.N. Baskin was a judge in Utah, not particularly friendly to the church. When Baskin was testifying before a committee of Congress and told about the blood atonement and how Mormons just had it within them due to secret covenants of cruelty to murder their enemies. And Elder Cannon said, if we are so murderous, if enemies of the church are simply sent to hell across lots, why are you sitting there smiling? You are a known enemy of the church and have lived undisturbed among us for many years. I think it's a perfectly permissible answer for a Latter-day Saint who is confronted with something shocking about the Mountain Meadows Massacre to say, I don't know anything about that. What I do know is that it's not part of my religion. I've never heard it defended or advocated. I do not have a testimony of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. But we're talking about what historians can do. The best response to bad history is to write good history. Juanita Brooks wrote one such work. During the past year or two, new attackers have entered the fray, as you know, recounting the massacre in all its horror, and this time laying the responsibility squarely on Brigham Young. And I wish I knew the complete story behind that story. Individuals of means are willing to subsidize works of this kind. And not surprisingly, there is an audience out there ready to publicize it and lap it up. Now, instead of simply writing a review, and there have been reviews written, and the Fair Side has some items, and Farms has some reviews. But in addition to that, 3 historians have undertaken an exhaustive study of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Richard Turley, Ronald Walker, and Glenn Leonard are in the final stages of a book that fully satisfies what I urged earlier. It will be thorough, using more sources than anyone else has ever used. It will be comparative. It will place the event in its wartime context. It will be the book that anyone who presumes to write on the subject simply must come to grips with. Bad history, the attack history of the anti-Mormons, will be shown for what it is by superior history. Is not this a model? One can think of a series of controversial and problematical episodes of our church history with newly available sources, with fresh questions. They are ripe for re-examination. And I'm not giving you an exciting original idea that no one else has ever thought of. Some articles and books have already done what needs to be done, but there is much yet to do. We can be sure that our worthy opponents will not close up shop and will not cease to mine Mormon history for anything negative they can use. And if many Latter-day Saints simply ignore their attacks, I am not surprised. After all, they have careers to pursue, families to raise, callings in the church to perform. Without seeming hugely upset over incidents in our church history. They have work enough to do ere the sun goes down. But we also have historians, both professional and amateur. And they also have a work to do. I don't mind calling on our apologists, including those present here today, to write good history. You need not embark on a huge multi-volume project like Pastor's 20 volumes. It can be a study of one incident or one problem, eventuating in an article or a 2-page response. If it is a historical question, let our treatment be good history. Simply treat a given topic in a way that satisfies any honest reader and in a way that meets the accepted standards of scholarship. Some of our apologists are already doing this, and I acknowledge that and appreciate it. They have defined a historical problem with precision, examined all the evidence, subjected it to the necessary critical analysis, and presented their findings. Those with the requisite training, skills, and time will continue to do this, making a contribution and perhaps even producing major works of history. The evildoers can fume and fret, can use their tiresome tactic of labeling the work as apologetic. You notice how they think that's some kind of wonderful argument? But if they are not brain dead, what they are really thinking is, hey, these guys are good. This is good history. I've lost track of time. Do I have 5 more minutes? Okay. How important is history? I have been speaking as a historian. What about converts in Mongolia and Ghana? Do they know, or should they know, 19th century history? What about those non-readers being produced by the government schools in this country? Will they know the details of Mormon history? What about the young missionaries preaching the gospel throughout the world? Are they shining bright because they have read history books for 10 hours a day during their teenage years? How much do they know, and how much should they know? Someone is making decisions as to what to include in the missionary instruction lessons. As I read through that material, I see no emphasis on history. Seminary and institute students thank you for your patience. You start to fall apart after a certain stage of life. Seminary and institute students throughout the world take courses, and some of them they get a certain amount of church history, especially as background to the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants. In their gospel doctrine Sunday school classes, Latter-day Saints throughout the world study sequentially the Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants. Only in the Doctrine and Covenants course is some historical background sometimes included. And even there, the emphasis is on the spiritual and doctrinal content. Finally, at present and for the past few years, priesthood and relief society lessons have devoted a year of study to one of the presidents of the church. Some historical background is provided, but once again, the emphasis is on the doctrinal teachings. The message that comes across to me, loud and clear, from all of these directions, is simple. Our testimony is not in the history of the church. So our friendly anti-Mormon comes to us with his version of Mormon history. He has probably picked up his example, as we have said, from other anti-Mormons. He is pretty sure his Latter-day Saint neighbor will not know about it, so he reads it. His eyes are bright with anticipation. Gotcha! Or what do you say to that? In view of that, how can you possibly be a Mormon? If he doesn't say these things, he implies them. And here is where faithful Latter-day Saint should take the wind out of the sails of his critic. Instead of collapsing or coming forth with a wail of distress, you shrug your shoulders and say things like this: I wonder if that's true. Or that isn't part of my religion. I have never heard it taught in any of the classes, and I have not read it in any of our manuals. You know what? That probably interests you a lot more than it does me. I'm not sure that it's true. I haven't heard what might be said on the other side. But I do know this: I don't have a testimony of the history of the church. Some of us might deplore the fading of church history from the curriculum. Of course, those interested can still read and study on their own individually or in study groups. To my knowledge, no one is forbidding such study, and I hope a good deal of it's going on. While I agree that knowledge of the details of church history is not essential to our eternal salvation, I do think it is natural and very satisfying to learn as much about it as we can. As I read about the Latter-day Saints and their activities, I can be inspired, amused, bewildered, surprised, proud, sometimes a little ashamed. More often than not, I am simply amazed at the perseverance, the tenacity, the determination to stay the course through good times and bad. Without even trying, I instinctively identify with the saints. Imperfect as they were and are, the Latter-day Saints are my people. But my testimony is not in them, and I hope theirs is not in me. Brigham Young once made a statement about Joseph Smith that our enemies like to smack their lips over, missing its point completely. How they love to misuse it. Here's what Brother Brigham said. You've heard this. I reflect a conversation I had with a priest who was an old friend of ours before I was personally acquainted with the prophet Joseph. I clipped every argument he advanced until at last he began to rail against Joe Smith, saying he was a mean man, a liar, a money digger, a gambler, a whoremonger. And he charged him with everything bad that he could find the language to utter. I said, hold on. Here is the doctrine. Here is the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the revelations that have come through Joseph the prophet. I have never seen him and do not know his private character. The doctrine he teaches is all I know about the matter. Bring anything against that you can. As to anything else, I do not care. If he acts like a devil, he has brought forth a doctrine that will save us, if we will abide it. He may get drunk every day of his life, sleep with his neighbor's wife, run horses and gamble. I do not care anything about that, for I never embrace any man in my faith. But the doctrine he has produced will save you and me and the whole world. If you can find fault with that, find it. And his adversary said, I have done. Well, what do you think Brother Brigham meant? You know how the adversaries use it. Was he giving carte blanche to church members, saying that it didn't matter how they behaved? Was he here giving his true feelings about Joseph Smith and actually describing him? Give me a break. If President Young's meaning isn't obvious, let me translate it. The truth of the gospel and the divinity of Joseph Smith's calling as prophet of the restoration do not depend on his behavior as a human being and do not require perfection in his life. Did Brigham really think that Joseph was a moral reprobate? That is the way some brilliant anti-Mormons use this quotation. Listen to this, also from Brigham Young. Who can justly say aught against Joseph Smith? I was as well acquainted with him as any man. I do not believe that his father and mother knew him any better than I did. I do not think that a man lives on the earth that knew him any better than I did. And I am bold to say that Jesus Christ accepted, no better man ever lived or does live upon the earth. I am his witness. But this is an important truth. President Young did not want his testimony to center on Joseph Smith as a person. Let's consider a statement by President George Q. Cannon. Do not, brethren, put your trust in man, though he be a bishop, an apostle, or a president. If you do, they will fail you at some time or place. They will do wrong or seem to, and your support is gone. But if we lean on God, he will never fail us. When men and women depend on God alone and trust in him alone, their faith will not be shaken if the highest in the church should step aside. Perhaps it is his own design that faults and weaknesses should appear in high places in order that his saints may learn to trust in him and not in any man or woman. I do not have a testimony of church history. In this declaration, I join Nephi, who said, O Lord, I have trusted in thee, and I will trust in thee forever. I will not put my trust in the arm of flesh, for I know that cursed is he that putteth his trust in the arm of flesh. Thank you very much.
We have just time for a few questions here, and I'll present these to you. You can answer them as you'd like.
I liked that yes, no response result. Hasn't this been a great meeting so far? I hope you all... I'm not meaning to praise myself there, but I hope you all know about the website of Brent Gardner. I'm a gospel doctrine teacher, and I turn to that on a regular basis. He has a commentary on the Book of Mormon, book by book, chapter by chapter. If you don't know about it, check it out. Critics often use the Journal of Discourses to discredit the church. Is the Journal of Discourses considered church doctrine? No. It's very useful to historians, but you have to know how to use it and be honest and understand what's going on. Just to pluck out a quotation completely out of context, and that's a shameful way to proceed. A recent article in Sunstone depicted you as a mean Mormon. Guilty. I prefer the word stalwart. Please share your view on Leonard Arrington's testimony. There are many in the new Mormon history circles who see him as their historian. Leonard had a testimony. He and I were very close friends and worked closely together for a number of years. We had our offices side by side. Nothing phony about Leonard. He didn't go behind the doors and say, well, we've got him fooled out there now. There are people who think that someone that knew as much about church history as Leonard Arrington surely couldn't believe it. And I can just be his witness and say there was a man who had his testimony of the church and of the goodness and the truth of the restored gospel. And he didn't find that it was necessary to pervert or distort church history, because he also did not believe that he was required to portray all Mormons as perfect people. And so he and I thought alike in that respect. I'm not going to talk about polygamy. How would I respond to Dan Vogel? Too much there to try to respond in 2 minutes, since he's written several books and assembled a lot of source material. I will say this, that when you assemble source material and publish primary sources, your principle of selection is all important. And I think we have reason to be suspicious that there is a principle of selection at work there that is not friendly to the claims of the church, but I'm sure he has done some useful things. Just too much there to give a quick response to. Do you have a feel for LDS leaders' attitude toward faith-promoting versus so-called honesty history? I guess the general authorities that talk to me are the ones that think the same way I do. I get lots of pats on the back and lots of friendly exchanges and saying we're all on the same cause here. Let's get good history out there, and they appreciate the quality work that's being done by historians. I think they are dismayed when the work of missionaries and people who are sacrificing to spread the gospel is undermined by these attacks from left field, but I just feel a lot of kinship with the general authorities that I know best, and that's quite a few of them. Certainly our people have shown conduct no worse than Moses' people. And the massacre at Mountain Meadows was no worse than the massacre at Shechem. Yes, that's a wonderful observation. Be nice to pursue that. This is saying that we can find parallels in the biblical times, especially Old Testament times, and we are simply repeating some of the same things. Do you feel that the rise in popularity of historical fiction risks playing a negative role in the lives of the saints? We have a lot of... Joanne, stand up so they can see. This is Joanne Bitton. And I say things like, no, I don't want to talk at a fair. She says, get up there. You need to share what you have to share. And so here I am. But we have a lot of grandchildren. How many do we have? 50? More than 50. See, I can't even keep track. Would you believe it if I said that some of them are non-readers? Do any of you have children or grandchildren that don't read, or don't read very much? That's the preface to saying I was kind of grateful for the work and the glory when it came along, because some of those non-readers read that, and they learned a little church history, and they developed a little feeling of sympathy and relationship there, and they knew some of what had happened at Nauvoo, etc., etc. Now, it's not my kind of history. I prefer Glenn Leonard's recent book on Nauvoo, which you won't read in 5 minutes, but which I recommend to all of you. But our teenage grandchildren are not going to read that. So I think maybe some historical fiction serves a purpose. But it is historical fiction and not history. Thanks, brothers and sisters, I appreciate it.